Welcome, folks, to the next episode of the Innovation Moment. Now, you probably have heard leaders say that innovation is for everyone. But when they say everyone, do they mean the people who don't look like us or don't have the same capabilities or the abilities as us? The question we are going to tackle today is how can we innovate for inclusion, and especially when it comes to disability inclusion? Now, joining me for this conversation today are Bryce Johnson and Jeremy Dawkins. Quick intro on both. Actually, we have an inventor among us today and what I call an intrapreneur. Bryce is the inventor of the Xbox Adaptive Controller and the co-founder of the Microsoft Inclusive Tech Lab. He focuses on designing products and services that actually make people's lives better, embedding inclusive design methods into Microsoft products. A connector of ideas, concepts, and people, he's truly making sure that innovation is for everyone. And also joining us today is Jeremy Dawkins, who leads design at What If, a company that Accenture acquired a few years ago. Now, Jeremy has over 25 years of experience telling stories and looking for trouble. But most importantly, placing humans at the center of every problem we solve, every experience that we build. He is a multidisciplinary design leader, driving growth and designing a world where everyone can participate. And for those who are interested, feel free to ping him later. He's also a regenerative farmer, a downhill mountain biker, and a refugee advocate. Welcome, Bryce and Jeremy. I hope that was I did justice to the intro. Please feel free to make any edits if needed.
That was wonderful. I really appreciate it. I will say though that nothing at Microsoft is ever done on one's own. So I am one of many inventors of the Xbox Adaptive Controller. There are really a lot of us. We were all quite privileged to work on that project.
That's great. That's great. Well, this is the innovation moment. So the first question I have to ask is, what does innovation mean to each of you? And maybe, Bryce, we start with you.
It's interesting for me because I think the focus of my work is really to empower people with disabilities in all aspects of their life, whether that's work or learning or play. These are all of the sort of things that make up the aspects of someone with disabilities' lives, and that empowerment can be seen in through many kind of angles. So innovation is definitely one of them, and we're always striving for technical innovation, but we're also striving for other things like process innovation and just kind of community outreach innovation in a lot of ways. I think one of the biggest challenges we have as a technology community when we're talking about empowering people with disabilities is the outreach and the community aspects of working with that community. And that's what we always need to do more of. It's always sort of forefront in our minds. And just sort of working with people through these challenges, because I think the reality is that we don't believe in this idea of one size fits all. And because of that, we have to work with people so that they can find the things that fit them.
Great, great. Jeremy, what does innovation mean to you?
Oh, absolutely. Well, Shivani, you mentioned it earlier. You mentioned looking for trouble, and I'd like to just clarify what that's all about. But that's what innovation means to me. It means looking out in the world, finding places that there are problems, and those are problems that we can solve for. So when it comes to innovation and inclusion, I think we have a very deep and wide field of problems to address. So innovation is going out, finding those problems, making sure they're the right problems to solve, and then really just bringing humans into the mix to make sure that as we co-create these ideas, the people they're most likely to affect are right there with us at the drawing board, as it were.
I love that. Love that definition. Bryce, now you mentioned you're the co-founder of the Inclusive Tech Lab at Microsoft.
Mhm.
What does inclusive technology or inclusive innovation or this whole concept of inclusivity really mean?
Well, I think for us, it primarily means being intentional. We have a mission at Microsoft to empower every person and organization on the planet to achieve more. And that's a literal goal. If we don't go about the edge cases of that intentionally, we're not going to ever meet that goal. That is our mission. And I will say that, I use that term edge cases um, in an interesting way, because I think for me, since my customers are typically the ones that are on other people's edge cases, I look at it really differently. For me, like, they're my primary customers, and to be honest, the able-bodied might be my edge cases. So it really all depends on the lens that you're looking at through your design process.
Yeah, that's great. Jeremy, I don't know. It looked like you had something to add there.
Well, no, I think it's the whole notion of edge cases and who that is, I think is really interesting. I think one thing I've had Bryce mention is before is that, one size fits one. And yet I think also I'm realizing that we also have to think, what can we learn from perhaps some of those edge cases that can make experiences better for all without making it a generic experience, one that can be interpreted for all. So I think where we're looking for the problems and where we're finding the expertise, that's all up in the air now. And it's just so interesting to find these pockets of lived experience, especially in those communities that have been excluded, and bringing their knowledge into what we're building now. I'm just really enjoying that moment.
Yeah. And to that point, right, Jeremy, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what should our ambition be when it comes to inclusive innovation?
Yeah, well, let me just start with perhaps where we need to start as innovators. I think there is a propensity for us to see the world very similarly to exactly who we are. And that's sort of a habit we're going to have to break. We're going to have to get out of our own shoes and not just step into somebody else's shoes occasionally, but really leave our situation to understand the world of others. And we need to make that almost muscle memory, but
Hmm.
to get past that, oh, I know my world, it'll work for me, and get into another mindset if we really want to break through in some of these areas. And just to add to that, I think we have to recognize also that um, we have, because we haven't been considering this, or it's certainly for me not for many years, to be honest, we have to recognize we've been passively excluding people with what we innovate. When we think of something that may work for us and we haven't considered who it may not work for, even if we didn't intentionally do that, we need to revisit that and have this sort of active mindset for inclusion versus just going, oh, maybe it's not for everyone. That's something I think we really need to address.
Great. Love that. Um, Bryce, I'm going to ask you to kind of show what Jeremy was talking about. Can you bring it to life through your lab?
I kind of want to respond a bit to something Jeremy said before we kind of,
Yeah,
Please
please.
do.
Go
um, when I think about empathy, and I think empathy is certainly important, but I also am a little bit skeptical of empathy in my practice, to be honest,
Mm,
because I think it can be really dangerous, that idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes, mostly because I don't necessarily believe that we as humans have the tools to properly do that.
mm,
And that's not a, I'm not questioning anyone's motives or anything like that, but I do think that, as a middle-aged, cis, straight white man, there are a lot of situations that I can't put myself in someone else's shoes.
Mm.
And so I think it is important for us in that empathetic mindset to understand that we are not the other person, and to really kind of make that distinction. And so, when we talk about our practice here in the Inclusive Tech Lab, and we talk about co-creation and we talk about participatory design, it is specifically because we recognize that we cannot be that other person, and that how vital it is to intentionally include people with disabilities, in our case, in that design process. So let me show you the lab, and I'll give you kind of an introduction, hopefully a quick one, into what we're doing here. Move this up a little. So I am in the Inclusive Tech Lab, Microsoft. We're in Redmond. Washington, USA. And we've built this space. This is actually the second version of the lab to be a home for people with disabilities when they come to the Microsoft campus. We are a big place. We have a lot of a lot of buildings here. We're over many, many acres, you know, tens of thousands of employees. We are a huge kind of campus because we call it campus. And so it is important for us, and we believed it was important for us to have a place on the campus to have people with disabilities come, that's their space. So when my fellow designers and engineers come into this space, they are visiting the disability community space on the Microsoft campus, right? It is not, so we call it a lab, but we don't really test people with disabilities in here. That's not its intent. Its intent is to be the most accessible space for the collaborations that we have with the disability community. So let me tell you a bit about some of the features of the room and why it's important for us to make it as accessible as possible. So I have soundproofing in here, which makes it less echoey. It's quite a big room, and hopefully my sound isn't too bad. With, you know, all of the soundproofing that we have in here. You can see at the floor, there's actually these patterns in the floor. We transition from one section to another. And we designed the floor a very specific way so that tactily someone who's blind can understand when they're moving from one section of the room to another, either with their cane or with their feet. And that was also very important to us. On all of our stations in the room, we have these QR codes and little Braille QR codes that a blind visitor can basically scan with their phone, and they'll be taken to a web page that describes the station that they're looking at. And then sort of one other thing I'll talk about is wheelchair doors and typical opening doors, according to the Americans with Disabilities Act, tend to be, I think the number is 36 inches wide. I'm not sure there. It's in the 30s. But I will tell you, if you see a power chair user going through an ADA door, it's a little bit like threading a needle. It's not very welcoming. So when we designed the doors in this room, we made them big. We made them open wide. We made these double opening doors because we wanted the experience to be welcoming in this space. And those are just some of the things that we do in the room to make sure the room is accessible. You all may be wondering what this section is over here. It's bright and sparkly. This is something that we've had in here for a while. This is a sensory room. I will tell you that this is a place that we are investigating. I don't have any answers. I don't promise any sort of Microsoft sensory room. What I do think about this space is this is a place where we can ask questions about the sensory needs of not only just people with disabilities and people in general, but specifically the sensory needs of neurodiverse individuals. And since we are a Minecraft shop, you might notice that my rug there is a big old creeper. I love my creeper rug. And the Minecraft team designed that for us. It's very wonderful to have something like that. Other sort of aspects of the room, you know, we have a lot of assistive technology. We're always kind of pushing this edge of sensory stimulation and sensory and proper sort of sensory muting, if you will. And right now we're a little over indexed on the stimulation part, and we know that we need to basically have options to tone it back. So if you look at something like that couch there, you know, we love it. A lot of people love it, but for some people it can be too much. So we will get blankets or things like that can be put over that. So that we're always thinking about adapting experiences in our space. We don't believe, like I keep saying, we don't believe in one size fits all. We believe in how things can change and adapt to the needs of an individual. And then sort of lastly, where I was, and I'll bring us back here. This space here is really where we explore a lot of our assistive technology sort of needs. And this is really where the bulk of the work happens. We have a lot of PCs in here and other things. We have our game center over there by the couches that I just was at. That's where we still kind of delve into our Xbox world a lot. But here we're looking at how computing can work, how general purpose computing can work for folks who are blind or folks who have communication disabilities. You can see there might be a, right there is a AAC device. AAC stands for Augmented Alternative Communication. So that's another thing that we're kind of investigating. But I think the core of what we do is really around how we think about our Windows PCs, our Surface PCs, and how they can be made more accessible.
I love this because it's it sounds like it's a place that is welcoming. At the same time, it's a place for co-creation. It's a place for inclusive design sprints, right?
Mm.
What would you say is kind of, an average on a weekly basis, like the percentage of usage of this space for its intended use?
Yeah, I think that's a really hard question, and it's hard for me to nail that down because we do a lot of outreach, and there's a lot of people who kind of want to hear our story and the story of our journey. I mean, that's kind of why I'm here, right? I think, and what I mean by that is, I think Microsoft, we don't necessarily have anything. We don't have any secret magic that I think anyone else doesn't have. But what we do have is we're a little further along on our journey, and people want to hear that story. So when I talk about the intended use of this space, I think it gets a little bit ambiguous for me because, I will meet with charities in here daily to kind of discuss furthering things like how assistive technology kind of works. I will say that I don't get to work with the disabled in here as much as I'd like to. And that's because as much as I'd like to would be all the time. So we do sessions weekly with disabled customers. We do bring in folks to learn from them. I think as an organization and as an innovation, and design team, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is to properly communicate to our greater design team all the goodness that happens in here, right? I'm very privileged to be able to be in here and work with those communities, and I need to basically figure out better ways to take what I've learned in here from working with the disabled community and sharing that with my greater design team.
Bryce, I have a question. When you are considering how to address the design requirements of something, how do you calibrate which parts of the community you're going to design for?
Yeah, I mean, I think in terms of prioritization, that is an important question. When I talk about other people being on different parts of the journey, the one thing that we don't have to do here at Microsoft is justify why we think it's important to empower our disabled customers. But we do have to justify why we are advocating for a specific solution and who does it address. And we have to find that balance. So, the way that we do that here is we think about reach and impact. When we try to work across many different types of disability. So one of our principles of our inclusive design methodology is this idea that we call solve for one, extend to many, where we believe that if you're solving for someone with a permanent disability, people with temporary and situational limitations also gain benefit. But I also look to that principle as a way to address interrelated needs of disability through design synthesis. So what I mean by that is it's really common in the accessibility world to take a clinical or engineering approach, which is you find a bug and you find a fix for the bug. And that's great. That's fundamental work that needs to happen. But our inclusive design practice is really about understanding the landscape of needs across spectrums of both reach and impact, and then finding solutions that we feel can make the most impact and at the same time reach more people. So can I give you an example of that with the adaptive controller?
Yeah.
Um, when we started this guy, we were actually looking at it from a very different kind of perspective, because we were looking at how we were going to augment this. We love our traditional controller, and we too were looking at fixing the bugs with this instead of kind of going in another direction. And what we found was that the limitations of this form, so you want to be able to, use this because these come with every Xbox. You don't want to have to waste these. But the limitations for people with significant disabilities, it made it very hard to augment this. So we actually have a feature on Xbox, which is crucial to the development of the adaptive controller. We can't talk about it enough. We have a feature on Xbox called Copilot, and Copilot gave us the freedom to explore this form. Copilot allows the Xbox to take input from two controllers and act as one. And so that gave us the freedom to explore this form, which allowed us to do more across interrelated disability. We definitely started from a place of limb difference, right? Where we were working with vets with limb difference and vets who have some sort of tetraplegia. That was kind of where we went from. Then we moved on to cerebral palsy and understanding the needs of folks with cerebral palsy. I will say one of the things that we've learned kind of since all this work started, you know, a lot of people, especially vets, they acquire their injuries, right? They acquire them through accidents and other kind of mishaps like that. But cerebral palsy, you're born with. And the needs of individuals who are adapting to a situation that they're in their life now are actually different than talking to folks with CP who always had CP, right? So I think like that's a piece of a nugget of how we think about this that makes that interrelatedness more complex. And so again, like taking all of these disparate groups and then coming up with like a single form that can address the needs of multiple groups is how we approach that reach and impact in our inclusive design practice, right? So we're trying to do more with less. I think, I think we're all trying to do more with less. So, I think that's really how we approach it. And I hope I explained that kind of correctly, but it really is like reach and then impact. So if I put it into another way that I'm thinking about it a lot now, if you think about individuals in schools, you think about kids that have learning disabilities like dyslexia, that's fairly common. And that's really important for us to address. But that doesn't mean that I don't address children like who have muscular dystrophy or other sort of more physical disabilities where they're interfacing with computers is really a much higher barrier. So those types of folks it's more impactful for us to empower them, but we still have to think about reach. We still have to think about all those kids with dyslexia.
Bryce, something you said caused another question. I think it's a question in me, which I think in our world, we're often brought a bug to solve.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's just to avoid that lawsuit.
Right.
It's trying to be compliant to whatever the standards are, whether they be digital or physical. But I think you're suggesting that's probably not the best path forward. And that while there always will be issues with compliant, we have to look beyond that. I think this is what you're saying.
I mean, yes, but I also think even from that compliance angle, what we're trying to do here is change the culture of Microsoft to intentionally, to use that word again, include people with disabilities in the things that we make. Thing about a bug workflow, and I've been in accessibility a long time, and I've seen bugs get logged, and I've seen engineers do their darndest to go fix those bugs, and this is like, I don't want to belittle this work. This is very important work, right? Those engineers leave the project, they go to a new project, a revision of the app or website or whatever comes out. New engineers come on board who weren't there for the last bug cycle. They reintroduce the bugs, right? Because they're coming at it from their point of view, which might not include people with disabilities. And it's not no one's fault, right? It's just the reality of the situation. So what I think we're trying to do here in the Inclusive Tech Lab is to develop a culture of kind of questioning whether or not we know exactly what we're doing and how we engage with that community so that we do not reintroduce bugs, right? Like, it would be a huge win for us to eliminate regressions. And we're certainly not the only ones doing this. There are many talented teams across Microsoft who continue to sort of educate our developers and designers to make sure that we're not adding things that are disabling for people into the products that we make.
I love this, Bryce, because I think what you are doing in the lab is here's where it is unique in that, sure, yes, fantastic. You are looking at software, device, accessories, processes from an inclusion standpoint, right? You also talked about the inclusive design methodology. But I think the fundamental difference is the culture and the mindset that you are trying to kind of permeate through the rest of the organization. I think that piece is really unique with what you're doing in the lab.
Yeah, thank you. And we definitely, we're all, even within the company, we're at different parts of the conversation.
Right.
And I
Yeah.
think we all kind of approach it from different ways. Like one of the things that I will, just to give you a little personal, like when we started this, I was trying to come up with the ultimate checklist, right? To kind of eliminate this stuff. And the problem that I ran across was that to have a checklist that was concise and actionable meant it was intangible,
Mhm.
um, because I was trying to do everything in 12 bullet points, right? And you can't. You can start from a philosophical point of view with 12 bullet points, but you can't really provide any. Well, I shouldn't say that. Maybe hopefully someone will prove me wrong someday and come out with the ultimate 12 item checklist. But I think, what I've kind of experienced as inclusive design has evolved, not only in Microsoft, but like around the industry is, as this practice matures, I'm very confident that you will be able to find a place in it that meets your kind of level of specificity and what you're interested in. So to give you an example, I used to work with the Gaming for Everyone team over in Xbox. We examined all types of marginalizations, race, gender, sexuality. Um, there's a lot, disability, lots of things. And when you're taking like that diversity and equitability and inclusion, when you're taking it at that high level, you have to be a little bit more principle and goal oriented. You can't be tangible. It's really hard. Um, I've since been fortunate enough to be able to focus on disability. So I'm at this level down from that where there's disability. We have partner teams here at Microsoft that are doing excellent work in going a level down from disability and thinking about specifically things like mental health, right? And that's a facet of disability. So I'm very excited that, the industry and the practice is maturing enough to be able to support all of these things. And it'll be great to see how it grows. I think the other aspect of it is I have to kind of remind myself all the time that I work in hardware and operating systems and platforms. Not a lot of people do that. So like the work that most people who are doing this work are they consume the stuff that we make, not they make the stuff that we make. So, I have to kind of remind myself that all the time. And, so when I look to like other companies who are diving deep in here, Airbnb's done some great work and Adobe's done some great work here. And it's wonderful to see their point of view, based off of their work, reflected in this guidance.
But then, what are some of the barriers? I'm hearing the excitement and the work, and other companies doing it too. But what are some of the barriers to doing this inclusive design, inclusive innovation, and what can we do to overcome some of them?
I will say that I think the biggest one, and it's this is a hard one because I fall prey to this myself. We all do, is our own biases, right? Um, it is really easy to say get over your biases. It would be a lot different if you said to someone, "Hey, ignore your life experience, right? Ignore everything that makes you
Right.
you,
Right.
and put that aside." So when Satya talks about moving from a know-it-all company to a learn-it-all company, that's really intentional, right? It's this idea that yes, we can be experts, but we don't have to always have the answer right away. We don't have to come into the room and go, I know what's best. I've been in this industry a long time. I certainly remember it's so much better to work in it now for me than it was like 10 years ago, when the expectation was, well, the person with the best idea and the loudest voice in the meeting room wins. Right.
Yeah.
And, so that's what we're moving away from.
Mhm.
And that's the culture we're trying to cultivate. And that's really, and again, I'm at this like little slice of disability. So I think for me, um, it really is about just sort of getting people to experience things that are beyond the regular experiences. Most of my colleagues don't know anybody with disabilities. Most people that, when they see me around people with disabilities, they'll see someone who is comfortable, sometimes perhaps too comfortable with like the disability community, meaning like I crack some jokes sometimes with some of my disabled peers that should get me some stares, but that's the kind of thing that we're in. We're a group of people. We crack jokes. My colleague in here, Solomon, has one hand, and I'm ruthless about one-handed jokes with him. So he's very kind about it, but so is the whole team. We all get a good laugh out of it, but at the same time, we enjoy that because we are inundated with it. We are immersed in this space. And if you're in disability, it's really easy to be serious all the time, and that makes it hard.
Yeah. Yeah. Jeremy, I have a question for you. What are some of the attributes we need to consider when designing for inclusive innovation?
Yeah, I think some of those attributes, and I think they're very similar to what Bryce has mentioned earlier. But it also speaks to something which we were just talking about recently, which is we are a little bit uncomfortable about what we don't know.
Mhm.
And so I would say the first part of any journey on this is really about recognizing those barriers, spending time with people, understanding them, and actually, if I may say, to say what Bryce said here, we need to get comfortable in those situations. If we're, for example, if the issue of inclusion is one of race or one of gender identity or one of disability, we have to allow ourselves some time to learn how to be within that environment, to get over some of our anxieties about how to talk about it. I would even say, in the same way as Bryce was joking, get comfortable to a point where you can make mistakes in the conversation and allow each other the right to make those mistakes and move on. We'll often use the phrase, let's walk with grace and pace. The worst thing you can do is get into a conversation where we start wordsmithing what somebody has said and we miss what the bigger objective is here, which is inclusion. So I'd say recognizing those barriers would be the first part. And the second thing, which, and I'm hoping I'm a learner mindset as well. We absolutely believe we have to always be working with those communities, never imagining that we're doing empathy exercises where we wear suits that show us what
Right.
it's like to have arthritis or something like this. We do not have the lived experience. The only thing we can do is be active listeners and active learners. So I think get familiar with the barriers, work with, and then I believe as people in a professional environment, we have to understand that we need to be looking for where the opportunities for this are broadly. What can we learn from these communities that we can bring into our everyday and make it a fundamental, just like we're seeing closed captioning, for example, on Teams or on video broadcasting things. These are things which have a specific inclusive purpose, but in fact are extraordinarily useful for all of us. So that sort of maybe starting in one place, but recognizing we're innovating for a broader audience, I believe is pretty critical.
Yeah, I think that's wonderful. It's funny, over my shoulder right there, you'll see that I have some simulators that I have in the lab, and we started off in that space, but kind of quickly learned that that idea of role playing disability is wrong. It's fundamentally wrong. So I have them. And I keep them because I do sometimes think, and the way that we express this is that we use these things to generate ideas and not to validate decisions. right? That's sort of the line that I think we're trying to be there. But I will say that, to be honest, we don't use them. They're kind of collecting dust over there. Um, but like, I really appreciate what you're talking about comfort. Because I do say that with my teams all the time, that, don't let your comfort get the best of you. Right. Um, because this is uncomfortable. We had executives, we have guidance at Microsoft about how to talk about disabilities from an official point of view. And when I was consulting on that, the first piece of guidance, because you'd hear these executives say, well, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So the first rule that we put in there in the guidance was, you're going to say the wrong thing. Like it's just going to happen. Right. And I think because the community is not monolithic.
Right.
Lots of people have different ways of talking about things. So it's exactly what you said around, having grace and understanding that you can make mistakes and you can move on, and mistakes don't mean that you're a failure or a bad person. It's just something to kind of pivot from. And that's sort of what we try to do here.
Yeah. So, Bryce, then how can leaders or organizations actually practice inclusive innovation? Meaning, how can they embed this into the company's DNA, the mindset, the culture, the processes?
As much as we've evolved and tried to evolve our practice here and bringing in people with disabilities, a very important part of the growth of my team, is that, we have people with disabilities on the team, and not only sort of in roles where I'm a principal researcher here at Microsoft. My disabilities are invisible. I mentioned Solomon, who's on our team, who is limb different. So he is non-invisible, but our boss is a man named Dave Dame, and Dave has cerebral palsy. And Dave being in those leadership meetings, advocating for people with disabilities, has been the greatest thing ever. It really does. It keeps it at our executives teams, like top of mind. And it's that presence, and when Dave came on board, we, we talked to a lot of people in the industry. Dave didn't actually have any accessibility experience. But Dave was an executive with cerebral palsy, and we knew that presence and the way that he could kind of command a room was exactly what we needed.
I think one of the things we have to consider is whether inclusion is a standalone budget or it's fundamental to anything we innovate.
Hmm.
And I don't want to see the end of inclusion or ID&E budgets, but I think we would do a lot better if we think of what we're innovating generally, whether it be in tech or in experiences or in physical product design, to be having an inclusive mindset in all of that versus a standalone budget or a standalone conversation around, now what do we do about inclusion? So I think this is another shift that we need to make fairly holistically, and really help our clients, in our case, see it that way instead of considering an extra budget, which is an extra expense. No, it isn't. It should be embedded in everything we do. And I think it's on us to help bring those other voices, those other communities into core innovation practices. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I am not in any rush to ever leave the engineering team. You know, we have a specialized accessibility team at Microsoft led by Jenny Lefurry, who is wonderful. But I'm an engineer. I'm a designer. I work on product. And I think what we've seen here at Microsoft is you've seen an allocation of product managers' time to ensure compliance, right? Now, these are people who believe in accessibility and believe in empowering people with disabilities. And they are putting up with doing compliance work because of this belief. And, one of the things that we hope to do through the lab and through our inclusive design programs is really empower them to create accessible innovation. These people, my colleagues, deserve the opportunity to do more than just accessibility compliance. And so that's really, I think, a big goal for us that we're trying to kind of get to in this space and allowing that.
Yeah. So, organizations who would like to pursue this, how does one get started? What is the first step that people can take towards inclusive innovation?
Yeah. I hang out with people with disabilities. I mean, it's funny to say that. I get a lot of students that want to like they like the work and they want to mentor. They want some mentorship, and they call me up and they go, "Hey, can you have a call with me on Zoom or Teams or something like that? I'd like to chat about your work." And I'm like, "Do you know anybody with disabilities?" And they're like, "Nope." And I'm like, "Better go meet some because I want you to bring them to the call."
Yeah.
And they're like, "But I don't know anybody." And I'm like, "Sorry, step one." you know. And it's a little bit of tough love there, right? It's like a little bit of like, yeah, and but at the same time, like for me, I need all the time I can get with the disability community. So that's it is important, and it is a tricky step one, right? Like
Mhm.
because everyone it's that comfort, it's leaving our organization and our teams.
Yeah.
No, but again, like there are multiple ways to do it, right? Like we bring people with disabilities into our teams. We have one of my immense privileges here at Microsoft is that we have a really wonderful employee resource group that have multiple sort of facets of disability. So when people go, well, I don't know any blind people, I kind of go, yeah, I got at least a couple dozen that I can just email, right? And those are employees. So, that's why I say like we're a little further along than I think a lot of other people, and that's part of our benefit and our privilege here. But I think the first thing I would tell people is to honestly and genuinely engage the disability community.
I could only agree with that. I think if I could offer a 1B from my perspective, or I think it's a 1B. With having done something like that, I think it's just in the same way as we ask our enterprises to imagine their growth ambition, or what is their inclusion ambition, because it's a heady topic. They're going to want to know, should we be focusing on race? Should we be focusing on disability? And I think sitting down and really thinking through in a workshop environment, just helping an enterprise understand, well, what's your ambition here? Is it to get to compliance? Is it to get to a place where you're intentionally thinking about your products and services? Or in fact, just like Bryce has mentioned to us, what he's trying to do, embed it in the very culture and the leadership of an organization. This is like, we first have to understand, well, what's your ambition? And from there, I think we can begin to understand the step by step in order to move ahead. And I'm not sure we're ever going to fully get there. That's something we probably have to understand, is it's going to be ongoing. At least that's what I'm beginning to recognize. And I would love to get it all done and move on, but no. I think in the same way as a topic like sustainability, which probably came firmly onto our radars 10 or 15 years ago, we're still working at it. I think we're going to have a journey with inclusion. I'm hoping we can help it move faster than perhaps some of the sustainability journeys have taken.
It's interesting that you bring up the sustainability. We pair with our sustainability team a lot, and we get grouped together a lot because I think it's like doing good, and that's fine. They're wonderful people. I'm in many ways I'm envious of them, and when I get a little bit snarky, I'm like, your stuff is all just math. Whereas like our stuff is like, really fuzzy a lot of the
Yeah, I think part of it's also because over the years, government,
time. Right.
not-for-profit organizations, organizations have formed consortiums.
Yeah,
They've been able to set
absolutely.
standards. So if you think about the path that sustainability has taken, they have a lot more um, overall support. It's not just being led by one or two
Right.
enterprises or only a few not-for-profits. It's more like a movement that has much greater all-round support. And because of that, and because of, if you think of COP26 and, some of these pressures from Davos and from World Economic Forum, right, that they are forcing organizations to say, what are you going to do about it? And to
Right.
see are then forced to declare and and put that in their earnings report, in their quarterly discussions, right? In the analyst discussions, because of that pressure and force from the outside in. I'd love to see exactly the same happening from a disability standpoint, kind of build that, have that snowball effect.
Yeah, it's really interesting that you mentioned that, because, when I talk with a lot of other companies and related peers, like I'll talk with GM. We've started to talk with Ford, um, other types of folks. We're engaging with like GE appliances and Electrolux. Because we think about these devices that have digital experiences, I think most of them of the accessibility guidance is rooted in this place of digital accessibility, like kind of how I mentioned before. Like I make operating systems and hardware, and most people make apps that go on to operating systems and hardware or websites or whatever those types of experiences. And so when I talk with like my peers, like at GM, that like I visited them and they were just like, there is no organization for us. So when I
Mhm.
look to like what you're saying to bring it back to that sustainability, like EP is powerful.
Right.
EP is super powerful. And it was created by an industry association. Right. And so I do really want to get to a place where, it is kind of a far reaching ambition to have an industry association specifically around product accessibility, that has both physical and digital components.
Exactly. Exactly. This has been such a fun conversation. Now, if there's just one or two things that you would want the audience to remember, one or two takeaways from this conversation, what would that be? Maybe Bryce, we start with you here.
It is funny. I think, we've talked about so many things, but I do
Yeah.
think that the primary thing that I want people to get away from our conversation is to be intentional, engage the disability community, embrace discomfort. Right. I think those are as an industry, we need to do that.
Jeremy, what about you?
Well, I love how positive Bryce is. I'm going to go perhaps a little more negatively, which is really a reckoning for us, which is um, if we are not intentionally designing inclusively, then we're probably designing exclusively. And I think that's something we really have to be conscious of. If we have to be intentional about it, or we have to recognize that we're not. So it's a tough call, but I think it's one where brands and businesses that take that intentional choice, I hope, will benefit from it. It won't just be who they're serving, but I hope it'll serve them too to take that stance. So that's what I would like people really be focusing on now, that intentional inclusion versus just letting it be.
Mm.
Anything else, folks, you'd like to cover that we have probably not talked about?
I have a question for you, Shivani.
Sure.
So um, let's just say you're our boss. Well, you literally are my boss. But how I think perhaps what would make sense for you? You're leader of an enterprise, and we're selling you on inclusion. What would you be looking for in it? My sense is it's not just the heart, that there's something else going on here that a business leader would be looking for in these conversations.
Yeah, so a couple of things. And interesting you say this, right? Because I was actually doing some research on it, right? And this is one of my favorite books, right? Called The Switch. It's by the Heath brothers, and the whole that book talks about it. This is about 2 decades old. It talks about that whenever you are trying to get somebody to do something, anytime you try to do any kind of a change, you've got to address both the heart and the head. And our entire conversation today was, for the most part, about the heart.
Right.
So, as a business leader, I would look for elements where I can pull in the head piece as well. And when I say that, it can be facts, it can be, that's why I brought up the whole sustainability topic and the pressure from government organizations, right, and industry organizations. It could be other external factors. So it's both the heart and the head. And then when you have that at the same time is when you can actually institute the change. Right. And I know you're
I,
laughing about this, Jeremy, because if you remember, even when we started this conversation, right? If you remember, I was like, yeah, it's important for us to get some of those metrics, some of that data, in order to, and then when you have both at the same time, you've then made kind of a head-related business case and then a heart-related business case as well.
yeah, I think that's really wonderful. And I will tell you, in our journey, um, I'm still on that path to figure that out. Um, and to kind of give you an example, we definitely sort of lead from the heart. But we know that we need to, part of that synthesis conversation, that idea of extending to more people is trying to answer that head question that you talked about. I think as a user researcher, the example I always give people is, let's say, I'm doing user research with 7 individuals with cerebral palsy. And I give them like 3 options, and 3 of them pick the first option, 2 of them pick option 2 and 2 pick option 3. And so I think a traditional kind of multivariate user research perspective would be like, well, option A, it's the most who chose it, was option A. But you're forgetting the fact that you're excluding more people, like you're excluding the
Right.
4 who didn't choose option A. And so, especially with something like cerebral palsy, we always talk about how if you've met one person with cerebral palsy, you've met one person with cerebral palsy, because it exhibits itself in so many different ways. So that's where I come back to the idea of design synthesis, right? Like this is when it's like, okay, well, let's take A, B, and C and come up with D that meets all these needs. And what are we learning from each of these variants, as opposed to just kind of choosing them? And I know that's not an entire, that doesn't entirely address your idea of head, but it's an aspect of it that I think about a lot.
Yeah. It's the same thing if it's when you were asking that question, I was thinking about like IND initiatives as well at organizations, right?
Sure.
Sure, yes, you had the Me Too movement, you had, the Black Lives Matter, all of that, which kind of added to the IND agenda. But honestly, before that, we didn't have, it was mainly a hard conversation.
Right.
That is when we started getting all the stats, the head conversation. And then instead of it just being a negative head conversation that you should do it, if you don't do it, here is the implication. The narrative changed from a negative head conversation to a positive head conversation. That look here, by doing these things, here is the positive impact that can happen to people, organization, products, services, all across. So it kind of, there's a analogy, a parallel to be drawn between, the IND effort we have, we are doing, the sustainability, right? All of these, which, and innovation is another one of them, right? It's how do you take these and make these mainstream rather than them being afterthoughts or side thoughts?
Right. Yeah.
I would add, Shivani, and I think what's interesting here is over the years, there have often had to be partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
And it might be that the future of this, because we're talking about such a heartfelt topic, that it might be about making sure that in the room is the head and the heart, versus necessarily imagining that one person can have the head and the heart. It might be.
I love it. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Yes, I love that. They don't have to exist all in one entity, one person, one organization. It could be a combination. Totally. That's a great point. We started our discussion with the question, how can we innovate for inclusion, especially when it comes to disability inclusion? And we had some great insights from Bryce and Jeremy. I'm going to, I jotted down some of the golden nuggets, right? Walk with grace and pace, recognize the barriers. I loved Bryce talking about having a learner mindset, be active listeners and learners, right? You also, Bryce, talked about engaging with the disabled community. and embracing discomfort. And then, Jeremy, loved your point on the concept of intentional inclusion. Now, we discussed what it would take to invent inclusively. And, the three things that kind of I synthesized were, first and foremost, exactly what Bryce said: recognize the inclusion, right? Leveraging people, process, tools, technology to move us from understanding the barriers to actually identifying the opportunities. The second is the empathy piece, the working with, not just for, right? Let's roll up our sleeves. Let's work with those who have actually had lifelong lived experiences. And then the third, which is invent for one, scale for many. You use the term, Bryce, solve for one and extend for many. Very similar to that, right? This is truly a mindset. And to quote Satya Nadella, for anyone who aspires to build great products for the greatest number of people, through data, experimentation, let's find ways to perpetually validate and scale opportunity. So, folks, in summary, we tend to see a world that is similar to our own, and therefore we engage with and build with for that subset of the population that looks like us and feels like us and behaves like us. But by engaging with people who have different lived experiences, inclusive inventing drives stronger, stretchier thinking that provokes in new ways. The hope is that being inclusive will push the overall design of our experiences and will advance people reached and lives improved. Thanks, everybody. And a big thank you, Bryce, to you, and Jeremy, to you as well.
Thank you.